watch a lot of the content that I've produced, or if you read any of the things that I tend to post onto social media, you'll probably notice that I use the word emergent quite frequently, perhaps all the time. And that's because I think it's actually warranted to use this word emergent in most scenarios when we're talking about complex social phenomena, or when we're talking about biological creatures, or when we're talking about pretty much anything that is a complex adaptive system. It is not exactly the most common way of looking at the world, given the fact that we live in the we live downstream of a historical process that has shaped our thinking and led us to think of things in a much more categorically rational perspective, in a top-down perspective, an analytic perspective, where we decompose the structures we see around us from the top down and then try to understand how those parts relate to one another based on what we see from that perspective. But the other perspective is bottom-up. And given that nature has presumably created everything that we see around us from the bottom up, it makes sense to try to think of how that world may emerge and how everything that we do in every situation in which we are embedded is itself a part of that bottom-up emergent process. The issue comes into play, though, or it becomes an issue when we're trying to think about these emergent structures and we're trying to wrap some sort of structure around the way that systems tend to emerge from disordered structures into ordered or complex structures, and to try to talk about these in a precise manner such that we can actually communicate effectively about the dynamics, the behavior of these systems in question. And this is a challenge for many reasons, but one of the primary reasons is because these systems, as they emerge, they do so in a way that is layered. And at each of these layers, we see different types of unique behaviors, different types of unique structures and interaction patterns that are simultaneously seemingly unique to that layer, but also connected to the layers above and below and around it. And that's an interesting concept to meditate on for a bit, because it also underlies, it's the same reason why we have different scientific fields. If you think about the structure of physics, and then building chemistry on top of physics, and then biology on top of chemistry, and then sociology atop biology, and so on and so forth. These, in many ways, the structure of our scientific disciplines is quite closely coupled with these different layers. And while that's useful for digging into the specifics of each layer and finding out a lot of very useful scientific information about the way in which those layers interact within their own realm, we're getting to a point where we increasingly need to understand how these layers, or how the processes across these layers, connect both within their own realm and also across these realms into other domains. How does biology feed back upon chemistry? How does how do our actual behaviors that are changed by our sociological tools, our mimetic tools, how do those actually bend back upon our biology? An example of that would be the ways in which we market particular types of food, and the fact that we're realizing that putting particular substances into our bodies can actually have epigenetic effects that either last for multiple generations and are not heritable, or in some cases actually become heritable. In the case of particular pesticides, the research has shown that if women who are pregnant are exposed to particular pesticides at a specific point, it can induce epigenetic mutations that are actually heritable for the rest of the generations of that mother's children or progeny. So there are these feedback loops between each of these layers, and we're just beginning to unravel what that implies, and we're just beginning to understand how these feedback loops interact with one another. The problem is that it's extremely complex to do this. It's probably beyond the scope of any given individual human mind. B, we have incumbent structures in our academic there's an inertia to the way that the academy has structured itself, to the way that research has structured itself, and science has structured itself. There are these unique universes, and each of these unique universes of study come along with their own grammar, come along with their own way of looking at that specific domain that is useful for their specific research. And therefore, working together across these boundaries requires, the same kind of translation that you would require if you wanted to speak with a French speaker and you were a native Spanish speaker. You need to translate across all these domains, and not only just two domains. You need to generalize that and be able to translate across every single one of these domains. The more your question pertains to the interactions across all these layers. So you can see that this gets very crazy and complex very quickly. But that also means that there's a lot of room for creating unique grammars or unique ways of thinking about and speaking about these processes across all of these different domains in a structured fashion. And that's what I wanted to actually speak a little bit more about today. So I've come across a particular ontology of emergence. An ontology, just a fancy word for talking about how we actually structure the knowledge and how we structure kind of the categories that we use to talk about a particular space or a particular set of ideas or concepts or things in the world. So this ontology of emergence by Manuel DeLanda in his book Philosophy and Simulation, The Emergence of Synthetic Reason. The whole book is actually really wonderful. Some of DeLanda's earlier stuff, I think, is a little bit, it's certainly shaded ideologically by his inspiration from Deleuze, but especially his later work, and this was a fairly recent work, he sticks more to he's a bit more on the realist side of things, and in this book there's almost no ideological content whatsoever. It's purely an exploration of this process of emergence, all the way from the simplest systems and structures all the way up through far more complex systems, including our economic systems and social systems. And so therefore it's an amazing book for anyone who's interested in trying to understand those processes of emergence, and especially how we might learn from simulating those processes. But at the very beginning of his book, before he goes into this explanation, which basically constitutes the entirety of the book of this whole process of emergence, he outlines this ontology of emergence that I find extremely useful. And the more that I use it to categorize and think about systems in the world, the more use I actually get out of it. So I'm continuously getting positive feedback from my use of this way of thinking, and it's improving my ability to differentiate and speak constructively about complex processes that would have otherwise been probably too confusing to try to communicate to other people. And so, because it's been useful to me, I think it has a pretty high probability of also being useful to anyone else who is interested in these topics. And therefore, I wanted to try to spread that word and get at least this idea out there, or at least this ontology out there for those who might find it useful. And that's what this is about. So after that long-winded introduction and setting the stage, let's talk for a brief moment at a high level about what this ontology constitutes. And so it's three parts. The three parts of the ontology are the three components that within a given layer can be used to describe the entities or agents or units in question within that specific layer. So at the physics layer, we might talk about the units in question, and you can split physics up as well, but let's just stay at the level of atoms. So we could say that we could have a particular ontological layer of atoms, and in this layer of atoms, we would talk about the properties, we would talk about the capacities, and we would talk about the tendencies of those atoms. And then that would actually be separate from if we wanted to drop down even lower and talk about the properties, the tendencies, and the capacity of something like, the more fundamental particles that underlie atoms. Or if we wanted to move up the scale, we could talk about, let's say, molecules. And we could say, what are the properties, the tendencies, and the capacities of molecules? Or what are the properties and the tendencies and the capacities of dogs or cats or wolves or societies at large? And each of these would be asking this question about what are the properties, tendencies, and capacities of the things in question at that specific layer. And the reason we want to do that, the reason we want to ask these questions about properties, capacities, and tendencies at a specific layer is because using those categories to talk about these systems is a very well thought out and effective method for connecting the behaviors that occur at one layer of this stack to those that occur at the higher layer, the things that this layer gives rise to, or the things that emerge out of this layer, and also connecting it to, as an emergent entity itself, to the lower layers in the stack from which that layer actually emerged. And so this is the reason why we want to talk about properties, capacities, and tendencies at each layer, because of the fact that they allow us to seamlessly tie the behavior of each layer together into much more interesting structures across these layers that can help us to explain the types of, explain and understand, perhaps first understand, then explain, the types of things that we briefly touched on in the beginning of this video, but that are increasingly necessary for us to understand as a society. So let's get into exactly what these categories are, or what DeLanda, how DeLanda outlines these categories and how they might be useful to solving some of the miscommunications and perhaps helping us to differentiate and use a better lens to understand some of the more controversial aspects of our social reality today. So first, I'd like to outline those specific three categories, and then we'll move into some more practical examples of how we can use this, how we can apply this ontology to start decomposing the things that are causing our society so much grief, because we can't necessarily find a common ground upon which to actually integrate our perspectives, because oftentimes what we're really doing is we're talking about different layers of reality and using different languages to do so, and they're not connecting, and therefore we end up in contentious situations. So that's where I want to go with this. But first, we're going to start with actually talking about the categories. So properties. Properties are the most basic aspect of any layer's emergent reality. And so properties would be something along the lines of, let's say that there's this book again. And the book, let's say that we could say a property of this book would be something like its width. And we could say that a property of this book would be something like its temperature would be a property of it as well. And these properties can be emergent. They are emergent in the sense that, the book is not made up of book. The book is made up of underlying, actual materials, and the materials are made up of molecules, and the molecules are made up of atoms. So obviously there are many layers underneath this, but the property at this layer is something that is a discrete observable unit related to the kind of static physical aspect, or the static physical object. And so, we could say, for example, what are the properties relating to a person? You could say something along the lines of height is a property relating to a person, or weight is a property relating to a person, or internal body temperature is a property relating to a person. There are all these aspects of people that, in this assumed objective space, you could take a measurement and you could get a property at a point in time. And of course, those properties can change over time. Like, for example, I could take the book and I could, cut the book, or I could burn the book. I'm not going to burn the book, but I could. And we'll get to that later, because that's a capacity. I could do that. And then the book is burnable, so it has the capacity to be burned, and that's an interesting symmetry when we get to capacities. But as we see, the first thing that we're talking about here is properties. And then these properties, you can build up a large network of understanding the various properties about a particular object at a given layer, or a given item of inquiry, whether we're talking about something like an atom, where you could say something like the atom's spin is a property of the atom. When we're talking about as a society, where you could say, in theory, depending on how rigorous we're being with our measurements and our degrees of error, you could say something like, well, what is the GDP of a country, right? In that sense, the level, the scale at which we're talking about is the scale of nations, and the property we're inquiring about is a measurement at a given point in time with respect to some emergent reality of all of the things that constitute that entity or that state, right? So GDP would be a property of a nation. Okay, now let's go from properties into capacities. And so we kind of got into capacities a little earlier there inadvertently, but it's good because it was a good segue, I think, into what a capacity is. Now, a capacity, you can think of a capacity kind of in the colloquial usage of the word capacity. It's kind of the same thing, but it's a little bit more formalized. It's a little bit more rigorous. So, for example, I have the capacity to speak. That is something that, given all of the emergent layers that give rise to me, everything underneath the layer of human being, and the specific factors that give rise to me as an individual, that all gives rise to a capacity for me to actually speak. Now, there are many processes that give rise to that capacity, and I don't actually have to speak. So the capacity doesn't necessarily imply that it's going to become an actuality, that it's going to become a reality. So there's a sort of potentiality to capacities. And there's perhaps an innumerable amount of capacities that a thing might have, and it's hard to count that because they might not all be manifest at a given time. So I'm not going to be talking, the word we use talking, and the word that we use for yelling at the same time. I can't actually do those things simultaneously. And so we see that capacities are these aspects of objects or aspects of agents that relate to the way in which they can potentially interact with the world, but that also relates to the world and the world's capacities, right? So take the example of, as DeLanda uses in his book, take the example of a knife. So the knife has, let's start with the properties. So let's call sharpness a property of the knife. And that sharpness property is a function of the way that the atoms are configured, and it gives rise to this property of sharpness at the level of the knife. And the knife, in its unique strata, in the level of the types of things that people who create knives would use knives for, in that layer that we're considering, the knife has the capacity to cut certain things, and certain things have the capacity to be cut by that kind of knife or that specific knife. Now, as you can see, there's some wiggle room in these categories because not all knives can cut the same things, nor can all things be cut by the same knife. And this gives us an interesting flexibility that actually maps to the types of rough edges that are quite natural when it comes to discussing the limitations of category systems. But we have these capacities, right? We've defined the fact that a particular thing, if in its possibility space, in the situation in which it's nested, it can act upon another thing in a particular way, it has that capacity. And inversely, by a sort of symmetry property, the implication that it can exert that capacity on that other thing, that other entity in question, so the knife cutting, let's say, an orange, that means that the orange has the capacity to be cut by that knife. Now, the orange has other capacities that the knife does not have. For example, the orange has the capacity to provide energy to the types of entities that we are, who require consuming structured molecules and breaking those structured molecules down to release their energy and keep their own combat or their own battle against entropy at bay. So the orange has the ability to do that, whereas the knife does not have that capacity. It does not have that capacity at all. You can't eat the knife and and maintain yourself. In fact, eating knives is probably a good way to accelerate entropy and end the life of a complex organism whose inner structure very much depends on not attempting to deal with extremely sharp metallic objects. That'll probably end the life of that being quite quickly. And this actually brings us into the third category somewhat nicely. And the third category is tendencies. Tendencies are kind of like capacities in some ways, but they differ in the sense that the tendency is far more related to the behavior of the item in question given ambient circumstances. So a tendency would be something like a knife. Let's stick with the knife example. Then a knife has different states that it can be in. So it can, if you raise the ambient temperature enough, that knife can be in a liquid state, and so it has a tendency to melt. That it can manifest. Again, like capacities, it doesn't have to manifest this tendency at all times, or ever necessarily, but it can given the right circumstantial, complex environmental variables. So in an emergent situation where all of the molecules in the air around it are extremely high energy, and all of the actual atoms are extremely high energy, and the energy level is sufficient to weaken the bonds of the metal in that knife, the knife manifests its tendency to melt, and then perhaps to sublimate into gas if you get it hot enough. And so these are sort of tendencies, and you could think of tendencies. This is where it's also really interesting to start thinking about how tendencies apply to people, because of the fact that tendencies are, these are something that we can think about when it comes to all of the complex variables that give rise to the idiosyncratic actions of a specific individual, given all of the other factors leading up to a particular point in space and time at which they will or will not manifest that tendency. So, for example, one could think about a tendency as being quick to anger. And it's a complex tendency. We don't exactly understand all of the factors that give rise to the emergent tendency to be quick to anger. And yet we all very much do understand the fact that there are certain people who are quick to anger, or at least this thing we call anger. There are many other tendencies. You could probably continuously generate examples, but we're not going to sit here all day and do that. The really interesting aspect here, though, comes in when we start thinking about the difference between the properties, capacities, and tendencies of a particular entity in question, and then also think about when we zoom out a bit and when we look at the emergent patterns that those individual agents give rise to. So, for example, when it comes to human beings, let's think about statistical distributions, because a statistical distribution is a simplified image of the emergent properties, capacities, and tendencies of the individuals that give rise to the statistical distribution via the modes of generating such distributions, which are effectively a way of sampling a particular set of properties at a given point or across a particular time duration and a spatial region. So what we're really doing when we're generating these statistics is trying to sample the properties. And well, at least if it's static. And if you're then taking many samples across time, what we're trying to do is perhaps get an inference, or get an understanding of, or we're hoping to observe whether these systems or whether they manifest certain tendencies or capacities. Because if you actually track something at a high enough resolution across time, even if you can't see every single one of the little entities in question, you can actually take statistical measurements of the emergent system that relate to the properties, tendencies, and capacities. And so, gas would be an interesting example of this in a very simple level as well. So think about what is a gas? A gas is a word, it's a label that we attach to the concept of many molecules or atoms, whatever you would like to say, bouncing around in a particular fashion, in a statistically mechanic fashion, or at least that's how we measure it. And that system of all the molecules give rise to particular emergent properties. And an example of one of those would be something like temperature, or an example of one of those would be something like pressure. Pressure and temperature are very good examples of the types of things we measure about gas. But gas is only a word we can apply when we have a sufficient amount of atoms to actually constitute a large enough sample set such that that emergent structure, the gas, can actually be observed across time such that we see certain properties of it, we see certain tendencies of it, and we see certain capacities for it. So, you can think about the capacities of gas, right? We can use gas in all sorts of pneumatic operations, and we can therefore do all sorts of intricate types of mechanical operations powered by our understanding of the capacities and tendencies and properties of gas. But therefore, gas has the capacity to, let's say, transport force from one place to another, which is what we're talking about in terms of pneumatics. We understand that there's a particular pressure, which is a property that is a function of the gas, and that by exerting certain influences on that gas, it has the capacity to do work on something at the other side of the pneumatic tube. And it's interesting because we also need to keep in mind when we're talking about the capacities of the gas, that the gas also has certain tendencies. What would be an interesting example of that? Well, you've probably heard of the Hindenburg. This was a very famous dirigible that was used or it was going to be used, I think it was in World War I. And this was, I think it was a German dirigible going to be used in World War I. I'll write an errata on that if I'm incorrect about that. I don't exactly know my Hindenburg history that precisely. The example was somewhat off the cuff, but it exploded. They didn't necessarily understand the tendencies of the gas well enough because of the fact that when they tried to scale up their understanding of its properties and capacities at the lower models, at the smaller scale models, when they did so at a much larger scale, they hadn't yet seen such a structure, such a configuration manifest that tendency yet, the tendency to explode. And it certainly did manifest that tendency. And after we observed it manifest that tendency, we changed our risk assessment of whether or not that was a practical tool in the war. And also, we updated our understanding of the properties, capacities, or the relationship between the properties, capacities, and tendencies of, I think it was hydrogen. And so this is how these systems evolve. This is how the properties and the categories and the tendencies of the properties, the tendencies, and the capacities of given objects across these layers relate to our understanding of them and also relate to each other. And like I said, I wanted to actually apply this to try to unpack or to try to pick apart a particularly thorny issue in our world today, in our social reality today, and in our political reality today. And I think while I understand that this is obviously likely to get me into hot water in 2019 in the age where no one can talk about anything without ending up in hot water, I'm going to try because I think it's useful to introduce this concept, and I think it might be helpful for allowing people to navigate this conversational and conceptual space. So let's talk about gender, and let's talk about men and women as categories, and let's talk about these categories in relation to the concepts of properties, capacities, and tendencies, and how they differ and emerge from the individual level up to the emergent layer, the statistical level, at which we begin to use words such as men and women. And this may not be an obvious point, but we do have to realize that humans are older than language. We do have to realize that many other animals are sexually reproducing species out there in the world. And we do have to realize that somehow those animals are capable of functionally reproducing, generation after generation without the benefit of what we would call language, even though obviously they do have the capacity to communicate via multiple different signaling mechanisms depending on the animal in question. But for humans, we should recognize that at first there were interactions, pre-linguistic interactions between what we consider human males and human females, and that the properties, the manifest properties of different beings in the environment. So let's say that I'm in an environment and I don't know the concept formally. I don't know the concept of male, and I don't know the concept of female. We don't have science. We don't even have language. We have none of this. Well, how am I going to differentiate? How am I going to understand based on my evolutionary tendencies, based on the tendencies that I have in this emergent evolutionary system? And those tendencies would be things like behavior driven by hormones and the way that we orient to certain stimuli. Those are tendencies of different types of agents in this landscape. And so how do we differentiate? How do we understand? Well, our entire evolutionary structure is designed to be able to differentiate between these properties, tendencies, and capacities. So as a biological male, as someone whose tendencies push them into a specific relationship with the properties of other agents in my environment. So for example, there's been multiple scientific studies that have shown that there's nothing to do, like consciousness doesn't even have to play a role in sexual attraction and arousal, or at least the basic states of it. So you can be shown, and this is what the studies have done, you can actually be shown images of sexually arousing images of the opposite biological sex. And I think for males, what they do is skin conductance measurements on the penis, which is an interesting way of taking a measurement. I can only imagine what being in those rooms would be like of the studies. It's a very strange, I guess the things we do for science, right? But we can show that there's a response, there's a skin conductance response beyond any reasonable doubt that precedes the time at which it would take for someone to even become conscious of their own arousal. And therefore you have to ask yourself, well, what does that mean? Well, it obviously means that the evolved structures in men and women, because there are converse tests that are done with women and they hold as well. They don't generate skin conductance on the penis because that's not what they were trying to test. And we weren't yet in the age of biological women with penises as we are in 2019. But we have to ask ourselves what this implies. It seems to imply the fact that there are emergent structures deep within us that are very old, and those structures have evolved such that they respond to certain properties that we observe, as well as perhaps respond to other tendencies that we see manifested in the environment around us. And also perhaps if we see people exercising specific capacities. What's an example of that? What's a capacity that might be a distinguishing characteristic of biological reproduction? Well, I think birth is an interesting candidate. So, if in the emergent structure of the human social group, every observer for as long as time has existed observes specific properties associated with the capacity to give birth and specific properties associated with the capacity to, let's say ejaculate, you're going to develop the underlying mechanisms for a category structure around sex and gender to emerge, right? And before language, there's no controversy here. And the same reason that none of the animals in the animal kingdom are sitting around having debates about sex and gender. There's not that distance between this extremely hyper-developed social layer that we've built atop our biological layer and the biological layer itself. And much of that distance and much of that abstract conceptual space is an emergent structure upon the biological realities that we were just talking about. So now let's see if we can use these concepts of properties, capacities, and tendencies to untangle some of what's happening between our biological level and the abstract linguistic space in which we are battling so vehemently today, especially on all of our social media networks. Okay, so the tension here emerges for the same reason that misunderstandings of statistics emerge. And that is because of the fact that a category like male or a category like female, these are words that only really exist in the space of linguistic interaction and communication. So the words themselves are not real in the sense that they directly apply to the specific, or they completely categorize the specific activities that are occurring at the biological level. No, they're not exhaustive. They're not necessarily something that is if it were a container, it would be a somewhat leaky container. And this is what we can call a leaky abstraction. So every word, every concept is a leaky abstraction, even into the level of mathematical concepts, as Gödel showed. Like it's actually impossible, as far as we know it, to really create this completely tight formalism into which all of reality can fit without having some leakage. And so we have these words, men and women, and we like to think about them as these concepts that are completely closed and that are not leaky at all, or at least that's how we have traditionally characterized them. Because remember, they emerged; those words emerged. We started using those words to talk about a pattern of the properties, capacities, and tendencies and interactions between those that we had observed historically, up until the point when we had to actually come up with words to describe the different types of actors within that complex scenario, which wasn't always the case. As we know, we were not always linguistic. And so we're in a space now where we have a group of people who are trying to say that, let's just be clear about this. We have the people who are on the camp of the backing the reality of biological interactions and saying, hey, listen, yes, I understand a lot of complexity has emerged on top of this, and a lot of our tendencies and our capacities are shifting and evolving, and even some of our properties might be changing, albeit quite slowly because evolution takes a long time. But hey, don't numb yourself, or because of your ideological adherences up at the social layer, don't go down here at the biological layer and plant dynamite everywhere and blow the whole thing up and try to say that there's no reality to it. We can talk meaningfully about the properties, capacities, and tendencies at the biological level, while also understanding that what emerges out of the biological level is a different landscape. It's a linguistic landscape that we're using to try to describe all of the ways in which not only the biological structures that existed for a very long time, but also all of the technological structures that we've added to that, layer upon layer upon layer, how all of that is interacting in this highly complex space, and how that is beginning to shift and beginning to change the different types of properties, capacities, and tendencies within categories of human beings. And a good example of this would be, for example, the study or the set of studies and research that Jordan Peterson likes to mention quite frequently with respect to the Nordic countries, and with respect to the fact that when you make these economies, or when you make these social containers more egalitarian, what happens, you see a increasing differentiation between the resulting profession or career paths that men and women decide to pursue based on their preferences. So you see a preference maximization. Well, let's see. Can we reframe this in this language using properties, capacities, and tendencies in a way that might be more palatable to both sides of this ideological divide? Well, we could, in theory, say that what we're doing by changing this, by attempting to stabilize all of the factors that are economic factors, or factors that would resonate with a particular type of or a particular set of capacities and tendencies that are shared pretty equally across men and women, or individual men and women. So inside of each man or woman, let's say that there are things that are very much the same, and that there are some things that are perhaps unique or distinct in terms of their capacities or their tendencies. And what we're talking about when we're talking about these types of large-scale social phenomena, we're talking about the fact that certain changes at the higher levels of complexity, at the emergent higher levels, they are going to resonate more strongly or less strongly with either the part of us as men and women that we share, or the part of us that is somewhat different. And this makes sense. This is what the data shows. So for example, to the extent that men and women are struggling to survive, or that they are impoverished, or that their primary focus is to try to increase their economic well-being, or to get to a place of comfort. So if they haven't crossed that threshold at which people, stop necessarily, getting returns to incremental wealth, what we see in that case is that the tendency, or the which would these be? Let's say that these are the tendencies of men and women, because preferences are kind of like a tendency to choose, right? We have a capacity to make choices, but what you choose is demonstrating your tendencies across time. And so what we're saying is that when we put these men and women in situations, let's say in a developing world, and let's say China, or we could look at the USSR for another interesting example of this, when you're trying to do this rapid development, you reduce the aspects of choice, you reduce the aspects of, you reduce the symmetry or the resonance between the needs of a given individual and which tendencies and capacities are going to resonate more with that. So in a third world country, it's we need to make money, and therefore both men and women are going to down-regulate the types of properties that are, or the properties, tendencies, and capacities that are related to perhaps immediate self-satisfaction or their specific unique set that they don't share, and they're going to target far more, in a far more, let's call it acute manner, the shared space of economic output. And they're going to therefore not have preferences as to which of these tendencies they manifest. If there's a job, there's a job, there's a job. Let's go to the highest paying job. But to the extent that that constraint is relaxed, to the extent that people can, people aren't as concerned with the day-to-day, with feeding themselves, with being warm, with the basics needed for comfort, what's going to happen is that any of the differences in their tendencies and capacities are going to begin to dominate their behavior across time, or it's going to begin to dominate, it's going to play an increasingly large role over time as you look at it statistically. And so if you zoom out to the higher layer, what you would see is that these two entities at the emergent layer of society, which are these categories we call men and women, they are going to start separating with respect to different professions that at the individual behavioral level either resonate or do not resonate more strongly with the shared or unshared capacities and tendencies of men and women. So I'm hoping that I know this is perhaps a little bit complex, and I'm hoping that this helps. I'm hoping that this is a language we can start using to perhaps show that what's happening is that we're confusing or conflating the properties, capacities, and tendencies of individuals with groups, and also of individuals with all of the processes that give rise to individuals. And the fact that all of the processes underneath and all of the evolutionary constraints, as people like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying will point out to you, and most other evolutionary biologists will point out, the layer of genes, it doesn't necessarily, it has to accommodate being either in a male or female body. So from its perspective, it needs to maintain the capacity to be either. And in doing so, it's not going to have any incentive to necessarily prefer one of those states over the other. And therefore, what we see is a sort of emergent balance between men and women across time, which is the fundamental narrative of any sexually reproducing natural entity in the evolutionary domain. There's a balance, there's an evolutionary balance between the male and female entities, and that balance isn't a perfect symmetry. It's an asymmetry usually, and that asymmetry of whatever type it might be, that asymmetry is related to many other specific factors that we don't have to get into in this video, but the asymmetry is embedded within a larger symmetry of the environment and a larger balance of the environment, and therefore we shouldn't expect, and it's crazy to expect, the fact that everything that emerges from that asymmetry, from the egg and the sperm level, everything that grows out of that, it's crazy to expect that we would see a totally homogeneous system, that we would see something that looks like one gender, or even something that looks like an infinite number. That's not what we would see, because what we see is an asymmetry at the very, very low level of sex cell, gamete. And because it's an emergent system, some aspects of that asymmetry are manifested more than others as the organism grows, and some of that asymmetry is not manifested. Some of that, there's a lot of shared evolutionary and shared genetic material between men and women. So I think I've actually just demonstrated how complex it can get to try to talk about and to try to unpack these layers across, try to unpack a topic like this across these layers. But I hope that this language of properties, capacities, and tendencies can be useful when we're trying to think across different scales and we're trying to decide whether we're talking about the properties, capacities, or tendencies of a specific agent, a man, a given woman, a given person, or whether we're trying to talk about the higher order entities in question, which are things like the category man, the category woman, and the fact that those are two different conversations, and you can't just blur them together, and you can't blend them together without knowing what you're doing. In the same way that if you blur all the paints in your paint set together, you're just going to get ugly brown muck. In that same way, if you just blur all the levels of this categorical or conversational stack together without understanding that there are these emergent structures that have their natural layers at which you must discuss them, and then you must build bridges between them if you wish to have meaningful or productive conversations. Otherwise, again, we're going to be stuck with the brown muck. And I think much of what we're feeling these days with respect to our interactions on social media is being stuck in the conversational equivalent of that brown muck. It is this space where we are all taking our own conceptual maps of the world and trying to superimpose them into one space without understanding that the structure and the connectivity between those layers and the way in which we negotiate the category systems between and across each of these layers has a lot to do with whether or not we're going to have any level of success communicating with one another and building structures that can bridge those gaps instead of amplifying the dissonance and the interference between us and the friction between us and the anger and hostility, the heat between us. You'll notice that all of those evoke very similar patterns, and that's because they are. That's literally what's happening. We're trying to squeeze everything into one space, and just like a gas that has the tendency to resist that, when you do that, when you increase that, when you decrease the space in which the gas is, it's going to push back and it's going to get hot inside of that space. this conceptual reality that we've created is much the same. And we're trying to take all of those conceptual particles, which have their own unique structure and their own essential structure that you can't just disregard, nor can you destroy if we wish to get anywhere as a society. And we're trying to conflate and compact all of those into this one online space, this one social realm, and that's just not going to work. And while I agree, and while I'm actually hopeful that those dynamics hold the potential, the flip side of the bad aspects of this is that this connectivity and this deep connectivity between all of these spaces give us the tools, or at least set the ground for, set the stage for making the types of social and intellectual connections that can give rise to the new transdisciplinary structures and kind of transcategorical structures that need to emerge and that need to be nurtured and grown and developed sort of by gardeners of complexity, if you will, if we are going to actually end up with something that is perhaps more garden-like than desolate, burnt, abandoned forest-like. And so yeah, I think that's probably where I'm going to leave this here. I know that was a little bit of a meandering video, but I think, we need to understand, or we need to develop grammars for understanding complex systems that are generalizable and practical. And I think that this properties, tendencies, and capacities grammar is quite useful. And I hope you do too. And if you do, let me know. If you don't, if you have a substitute, if you have another ontology for looking at this, and I know others do exist, I've seen others, let me know. And I'd be interested in discussing that. Secondarily, I think it's interesting to start having conversations and just start trying to apply ontologies like this, or specifically this ontology, trying to start applying it to the many social issues that we are seemingly incapable of discussing meaningfully. And oftentimes because we say people are speaking past each other, and one way to speak past each other is by being on different layers and literally just speaking the language of your layer, and not understanding that there's this complex nested structure. And so can we create a map of where that's happening? Can we try to understand how to have better conversations using these tools? So that's what I'm interested in accomplishing with this video. And if you're interested in accomplishing the same thing, let me know. I know people who are working on projects along these lines, and some of the things that I'm doing is also related to this. Or if you just want to talk, let me know. Take it easy.